Thank you very much, Clarissa. So it's with great pleasure to introduce the next team talker to you, my fellow classmate who not only held the graduation speech at our class dinner, which nobody of the Sloan Fellows will ever forget. He is a business poet. He is a person who easily connects with others and connects others. He is a brilliant mediator and strategist, and he knows what cities and communities really need to thrive. So please join me in welcoming Mark Anthony Thomas, Sloan Fellow 2014, my classmate, and the stage is yours. Welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm so excited to be here. I'm Mark Anthony Thomas. Ashley mentioned I graduated in 2014. I want to share a story about really my last 5 years, but I want to start with the narrative that really taught me how important MIT people are to the world. After I graduated, I proudly had my degree hanging up in my apartment. And my partner and I left after having it cleaned. We come back 5 hours later, and the cleaner's still there, and I asked, like, why are you still here? And he said he saw that MIT degree and had never seen an African-American person who went to MIT. And he wanted to make sure that he made me proud. And so it was that moment that I realized, like, now as an alum, I am part of a community that means a lot to a lot of people, but most importantly, to underserved communities. And coming from an underserved community myself, okay, here we go. Coming from an underserved community myself, which was the outskirts of Atlanta, if you've ever seen the FX show, Atlanta, it talks about, it captures the culture of Atlanta, it captures Southern hospitality, it captures like the history of hip hop and soul food and all those things, but it also talks heavily indirectly about how there are challenges with mobility and economic opportunity. And that was my upbringing, was that culture that they capture. And so it was something I was inspired to write about at a pretty young age. And it was something I went on to be a publisher like 13 years later, and it became the key topic of the media that I published. And so when I was publisher of City Limits Magazine, we covered issues around bad procurement, we covered issues around urban planning and poverty. And you can't really work that closely to those issues and not be inspired to want to work directly on driving that change. And so what inspired me to come to Sloan was really, how do I then take what I'm learning through media and through communications and really adopt that and understand how to make operational reform myself. And so after Sloan, I went to Los Angeles. And in LA, I had 2 specific roles. First, I was the first pilot through a nonprofit called Fuse Corps, which placed executive talent inside government, and they're tasked with really reshaping how they manage key systems. The second, I was the director of the Mayor's Operations Innovation Team, and that was a privately funded effort to really drive reform across the city. And so I worked on 4 specific issues. The first, the city of LA, if you've been through all 400 square miles of it, it is not universally clean. And so one of the tasks I was asked to work on was how do we then change that narrative and make sure that all areas of the city have economic opportunity. The second, LAPD and LA Fire had an extremely high number of injuries and workers' comp claims. And so I was asked to look at that issue and really work on how do we reduce that. That high crime level was actually was driven by the fact that so many people were out on injury leave. 2 other issues I worked on was reforming their procurement practices, which I had written a lot about before, and also finding the real estate portfolio that was within the city's ownership. After Los Angeles, I came on to New York City. And in New York, the problems are different. Like New York is having record job growth. It's having a renaissance as far as people wanting to invest and be a part of the city. And so the issues I worked on there through my role in New York focused on how do we then partner on economic issues to drive forward growth and drive forward inclusive activity. At the same time, New York was also dealing with, this is 2016, with the changing dynamics of the national conversation. And so there was a huge focus on how do we make sure the city is open to immigrant entrepreneurs and immigrant talent, which are key to really making the city dynamic. Like all tech hubs, the city was really grappling with the issue of inclusivity, and so this became a focus of my time in New York. Now, if you've had a career in business, you may look at these problems and say, these are so simple to solve. But that's not what this talk is about. What I've really learned through the last 5 years is it's not about the subject matter itself. It's about how do you really drive for change and actually implement your ideas and actually make those ideas matter in a way that transform the systems that you're leading. And so I broke down 6 different ways that I actually think change is implemented. First, you have to have a commitment to progress. And what that looks like, and you really see this, you see politicians struggle with this, whereas how do you actually make sure that you're honest with your stakeholders and honest with your communities that I see you, I see the problem, and we're actually gonna work toward improving that. And working to clean the city of Los Angeles up, one of the first things I did was travel to all 99 neighborhoods, meet with all the different business improvement districts, and really spend time letting them know that, look, we see the problem, we're gonna work towards solving it. The second thing is systems dynamics, which we all remember those classes. People really wanna understand a problem from you. And if you're a change agent, it is super imperative that you really can articulate how that change happened. And so I did that first when we were trying to clean up Los Angeles. And so it was kind of covered that we were actually working on a problem, we were working on a solution. The second with the real estate and finding the real estate, we were explaining to people how we actually didn't know what the city owned, and then how we actually had discovered the real estate, and how we're actually gonna move this process forward. And then the third, and implementing the procurement reform, helping people understand how a city that spends $8 billion takes over 1.5 years to procure services was like important for me to really make sure people understood that. The third is coalition building. It's not just enough to for you to own an idea. It is really important for you to make that idea collaborative with other people. And so I like to share examples in New York and looking at how do I make sure that the city, like I say, in light of the conversation we're having nationally, is open to tech, open to entrepreneurship, open to immigration. And we started to establish partnerships directly with countries and hubs that we really wanted to shore up those relationships. And so France was the first, which has over 100 startups in New York that are French founders. We wanted to make sure that that relationship was secure. And then, as we started to implement investments in future sectors like cybersecurity, we all know Israel is a major hub and has one of the strongest ecosystems in cyber. How do we then build relationships there so they can think about New York as they're expanding and exploring an entry point into the US? The fourth is you have to really clarify with people where you agree and where you disagree. And under the agreement piece, even if there are no resources available, people still want to understand that you understand where they stand. And so that was an important thing. And I'll share an example of with the foreign direct investment work I was leading in New York. There were some ideas that maybe New York should have its own entity that managed that function. And it wasn't an area I agreed with, and so it fell in my disagreement side, but I wanted to make sure they understood why I didn't agree with them. And that's super important. The fifth is you have to show proof of a coalition to actually implement change. And that is super important for people who may be hesitant or may want to make sure it's a safe bet. Actually understand that you have people on your side who really think this is sound policy or sound ideas, and they're supporting how you actually execute that. The last, you have to have a champion or a sponsor. And what that looks like, it can be a mayor. In my case, it can be a legislative bill. It can be a funder. It can be someone who says, okay, I want to anchor this idea and help you actually execute it. And so a few examples I'll show where we were successful is in Los Angeles, they actually had never had a chief procurement officer. And that was kind of like the pinnacle part of the overall reform. And so I really wanted the mayor to adopt that and transform that. And so we did establish that chief procurement office. Here you see where the city didn't know what it owned, and now it does. And we made that real estate accessible to the public so you can see the work that was done. And then on the issue of inclusion in New York, which is where I currently work, so much of our work now is shaped around emerging technologies. How do we make sure it's also inclusive for underrepresented populations, for women, for people who really want to be a part of that ecosystem? And so those have been my experiences over the last 5 years, really reshaping policy, reshaping how change happens in both Los Angeles and New York. And so I'm super excited about what the next 5 years will bring. Thank you.